Our speaker today, Dr. J. Hakes, has been director of the Carter Presidential Library since the year 2000. And if you have not visited the library, which houses the papers for the presidency of President Carter, and the museum, which houses exhibits of its own, including the replica of the Oval Office and other exhibits that come to town periodically, I encourage you to do so. It's one of the great attractions, I think, in the city. Jay is a native of the Midwest, grew up the son of a college professor. After earning his bachelor's degree at Wheaton College in Illinois, outside Chicago, he came south to pursue a master's and PhD in political science at Duke University, where he was both a Duke Fellow and a Shell African Fellow. His professional career began with his teaching at the University of New Orleans, where he taught and wrote about presidential elections. In 1976, he coordinated the Carter primary campaign in New Orleans, and the next year joined the Carter administration in Washington. When the occupancy of the White House changed, Jay moved to Florida, where he worked for the next 12 years with Governor and later Senator Bob Graham, where he was State Director of Energy and later Chief of Staff. In 1992, he was a Clinton member of the Platform Committee for the 1992 Democratic Convention, and the next year returned to Washington to be the administrator for the Energy Administration and became the major spokesperson for the Department of Energy. He, during the past 14 years, has testified before dozens of congressional committees, has briefed many government officials from the U.S. as well as around the world on energy-related issues. In fact, it appears he may even been briefing the president and our governor here in Georgia, as we're hearing vocabularies that we have not heard before. Jay is currently working on a book of energy from Nixon through the Reagan administration. The timing of today's presentation and speaker is great, we think, and this time we're very pleased to have Jay Hakes address the topic that was announced for today. Jay Hakes.
First, I'd like to thank those who've helped publicize the event today. President Bush for his recent statement on climate change. Having heard about this speech, the Chinese government yesterday issued a 62-page report clarifying its position on climate change. And last but not least, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution this morning had its lead editorial on the subject of international obligations on climate change, and also had an op-ed piece across from that. I would like to say in starting that I am not speaking on behalf of Jimmy Carter. I am not speaking on behalf of the Carter Library, and I am not speaking on behalf of the United States government, of which I am a part. Several of us have been granted some license to deliver our own best judgment on certain issues without having to get clearance from higher-ups, and so I will take advantage of that and try to be very candid today. Those caveats having been stated, I would urge you to take advantage of the opportunities at the Carter Library and Museum, as has Charlie already. Late in this month, we're opening up an exhibit on the 25th anniversary of the Carter Center. We'll even have a guinea worm there. We're going to have a life-size latrine for viewing only. But it will give a view of this work around the world that's often not realized. And tonight there's a speaker on the coalition in the United Kingdom that brought Winston Churchill to power by an author named Lynn Olson. Is that at 7 or 8? It's at 7 o'clock, so you still have time to get out to that. Now, what I found, I was at the Energy Information Administration. That's not the PR arm of the Department of Energy. That's the data collection and analytic part of the Department of Energy, where we collect all the data, and we do forecast. We're the ones that forecast our gasoline price is going to go up or down this summer. We forecast what the price of oil is going to be 25 years from now, and we do what-if statements for the Congress and the administration on what would happen if policies were changed. And that was why I was often asked to speak to Congress. And clearly, the most difficult thing to opine on was climate change. In fact, in 1998, I got into a rather major dispute with the Clinton administration. I was a presidential appointee, which made this slightly awkward. But the point was that the White House had issued a study on the Kyoto Treaty suggesting that it would not cost very much money for the United States to comply with the Kyoto Treaty. They said at the time that we could comply with the Kyoto Treaty if the price of gasoline went up 5 cents a gallon. Now, I would point out to you at the time that the price of it in 98 was about 90 cents a gallon. So it's tripled since then, and greenhouse gases have continued to rise. So I would sort of rest my case. But it was an unusual situation for an agency within the federal government to disagree with the White House on such a matter. The Congress several times asked the head of the Council of Economic Advisors to appear with me jointly on panels, and she always declined the opportunity to do that. But I tried to be candid on this issue and not pull any punches, hence the title of today's speech. Now, I have found in the last few years that one of the greatest ways to bring clarity to the complex issues of energy and climate change is to provide a little bit of historical perspective. So if you will indulge me for a moment, I think this will be helpful to where we're headed. The first National Academy of Sciences studies on climate change were released in 1977 and 1979. The National Academy of Sciences is a group that pools the expertise of all the scientists in the country. It tends to be a cautious group because it works by consensus. Therefore, if there are a few naysayers, they have to be very, very careful about what they say. But by 1979, they had basically laid out the theory of climate change and the argument that this was likely what was going on, much as it is understood today. That being that there is a natural layer above the Earth that traps heat. It traps heat because the light waves coming in are shorter than the waves that reflect off the Earth. So fortunately, there is this natural layer there that keeps the heat, with some of the heat within the atmosphere. There had been the feeling that human-induced gases were causing this layer to grow thicker, which would in fact mean that more heat would be trapped. And today, that human element has added about a third to the natural level of the greenhouse layer and is well positioned to go much, much higher than that. These gases consisted mainly of carbon resulting from the combustion of energy fuels. That's about 80% of it. And EIA, the Energy Information Administration, was the lead government agency for carbon emissions. And I sometimes tend to use carbon emissions interchangeably with all the greenhouse gases, but there is another 20% out there, and we just don't have time today to deal with all of that. Another thing that was noted in this study was that the issue is not so much the emission of these gases, it is their concentration. And that once put into the atmosphere, the gases stay for decades and in some cases centuries. So it's not like many of the environmental issues where you can clean up a river and see the results of it quite quickly, or you can improve air quality, you will see the results rather quickly. In this case, there's a huge time lag, so that even if you reduced emissions next year, the concentrations would keep going up unless you had reduced emissions below the level they were at 30 or 40 years ago. This means that action must be taken well before the worst results are seen. The 1979 National Science Foundation report was a little bit wishy-washy in the sense that they weren't comfortable with the temperature data totally. They were pretty sure that this was trapping heat, that it was going to raise the Earth's temperature, but we did not have the massive data collection points that we have now. You want to measure water temperature, not just in 10 places, but in hundreds of places around the world. You want to measure the atmosphere close to the ground, higher up, above the greenhouse gas level. When you get multiple points, things become more certain. But the Carter administration, in its closing days, issued a report by the Council on Environmental Quality that laid out the argument for climate change pretty much as it's understood today. This was in January of 1980. During the 1980s, the issue of climate change did not get a lot of public attention. More attention was focused on trying to repair the ozone layer, which is a separate problem. Holes in the ozone layer caused by certain chemicals were allowing dangerous radiation to penetrate. To some extent still are. But behind the scenes, many people around the world were working on the climate change issue. And this culminated in 1992 in a conference in Rio de Janeiro and the negotiation of the Rio Treaty, which was agreed to by all the industrialized nations, including the United States. Not only was it signed by the United States, but it was ratified by the United States. And basically what this was an agreement to stabilize emissions at 1990 levels. It was viewed as the first of many steps because the targets were much more modest than everybody felt would eventually be necessary. And it was agreed that the requirements would be voluntary in nature. Despite the fact that it was voluntary, it established some of the ground rules for international cooperation on this issue that are still very much misunderstood today. The idea that the measurement of progress would be based on 1990 baselines is a very important concept. One, what it was saying to the United States was, we, Europe and Japan, who use a lot less energy than you do per capita, are not going to force you to make bigger changes than we are. We're going to start from where we were. So even though the agreement did not include India and China in any meaningful way, it was an agreement that was very beneficial to the United States because, in a sense, for at least a while, they were getting a pass. They were going to make the reductions from a level, rather than sort of start from scratch and sort of apportion how much each country would get based on population or something else. You in a sense, kind of got grandfathered in to some extent. The other thing that's missed is the importance of the 1990 guideline, because what was assumed at the time, and this very much affects the current situation with the United States and China, what was assumed at that time was that some nations, some companies, some individuals would move faster than others. If you came in after 1990 and said, okay, we'll move the baseline to 2000, you have penalized the companies, you've penalized the nations who, in good conscience, acted first. So there's sort of a protection in here to protect for early adopters, so that late adopters can't come in and set a new baseline. Now, this is a subtlety that might escape a person just reading the daily newspaper. But if you read a statement by Tony Blair on goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and you read the fine print, it's from 1990 levels. When you see a statement from the United States government, they are rarely, if ever, from 1990 levels. At best, they're from current levels. Sometimes they're from levels projected from growth in the future, in which case they can actually be increases, but be sold as cuts. And there's a number of other ways in doing it. But once you move away from the 1990 baselines, you are rejecting an agreement that you entered into and making it a little bit difficult, I would think, to be trusted by people for future agreements. There was also the assumption that the countries would have to keep getting back together on a repeated basis to, if voluntary didn't work, which I think nobody thought it would work, it would have to become mandatory and the cuts would have to be much deeper. I will just say when the UK and Germany say that emissions will have to be cut basically in half by 2050, I think that's a pretty widely accepted number. That will allow the world's temperature to go up by several degrees, but it will cause a lot of dislocation, particularly if you have coastal property. But it doesn't trip off the worst of the natural feedbacks that will come eventually if it keeps rising. After the Rio Treaty, there was a very intense counterattack. One, it was said that the science wasn't certain. And in a way, it wasn't certain because there wasn't all the temperature data, but the scientists were quite convinced that their theories were true. And most scientists aren't going to want to stand up and say things are certain. They're probable or they're likely. But that was an argument. The other one was that reducing emissions would damage the economy. And the third one that I want to deal with today, because I think it's maybe the most important right now, and we have a limited time, is that the United States shouldn't participate until India and China were included. Now, obviously, if they were included, you couldn't use the baseline approach without damning these countries to sort of perpetual poverty. The reasoning, though, had logic to it because, one, emissions were rising at a much faster rate in China and to some extent India. And also, if you're involved in a business that invests in energy efficiency, it's much cheaper to invest in efficiency at the get-go when you're creating the product rather than retrofitting it later. So we have the industrialized world has an embedded infrastructure that either has to be replaced or retrofitted. When you're going into a developing country that's adding infrastructure, that is an opportune point to have an effect that's a little more cost effective. As a result of these arguments, the opponents were able to get a vast majority in the Senate against a ratification of the Kyoto Treaty, and in fact the Clinton administration never even submitted it to the Senate, but if they had, it would have been roundly defeated. By 2007, opposition to action has weakened somewhat. The collection of extensive temperature data and stronger scientific consensus has reduced but not eliminated objections to the science. As a result, as specific damages have become apparent, the idea that dealing with climate change shouldn't cost anything has become less defensible. One of the most interesting things to watch has been the change of the senator from Alaska, Ted Stevens. He, a year or two ago, was one of the leading opponents of automobile efficiency standards. Now the permafrost in Alaska is melting. So now he is one of the key sponsors of the bill, demanding quite stringent automobile efficiency standards. However, as these other two issues have softened, it has left the other issue as perhaps the main impediment to international cooperation. The China issue remains, and in fact, if you remember the Supreme Court decision that was rendered several weeks ago, where the court said that the EPA could not take the position that it was not authorized to regulate greenhouse gases, one of the administration's arguments before the court was that if the EPA set standards, it would cause a breakdown in our ongoing negotiations with China to get a joint agreement on this. Now, these negotiations have been kept a great secret since no reporter has been able to uncover them. But this was actually used as an argument in the court case. I thought that court case could have gone either way based on the merits, but as arguments like that came into it, I think it made the court more skeptical of the administration's arguments. Now, how are we doing at this point reducing emissions? I have brought with me today the greenhouse gas emissions from 1980 to 2004 for every country in the world. So I'm not going to read them to you, but if you have questions about a specific country, I'll be glad to provide it. I was going to be like Charlie and try to remember them all, but my memory's not as good as his. But I went through this, and I looked. This isn't the complete list that you have, and I hesitate to introduce numbers at lunch. That's really not fair after lunch unless you really had a strong cup of coffee. But let me say in my more detailed list where it's broken down by country, I could find very few countries that have reduced their greenhouse gas levels from 1990, including the countries that have ratified the Kyoto Treaty. But I did find four, and I want to commend them today. Poland, which had a very inefficient system. Germany, part of which had a very inefficient system, so it was a little bit easier for them to improve. Denmark, which has made dramatic progress, particularly in wind energy. and the United Kingdom. So we all owe Martin Rickert here a debt of gratitude as one of the handful of countries that has actually reduced greenhouse gas emissions from 1990. How is the United States doing since 1990? Through 2004, our emissions were up 18%, sort of roughly at the point of a percent a year. China was up 110%. This has led in some circles to China being viewed as a rogue nation, but one has to take into account several factors that make that characterization, I think, not correct. One is their economy has been growing at a rate of 10% a year, more or less. Numbers like that are somewhat subject to question, but I think that's widely accepted. So obviously, it would be very difficult in a poor country growing at 10% to be cutting back on greenhouse gas emissions, certainly more difficult than it would be in a rich country. But there's another factor that has received virtually no recognition. I would like to emphasize it today, and if there's one thing that you remember from this speech, this might be it. Until 2001, the Chinese had very stringent tariffs on luxury automobiles and gas-guzzling automobiles, as did India. These tariffs range from about 80% to 100%, and they were quite successful in keeping gas-guzzling automobiles out of China because all of their domestically produced autos were quite efficient, relatively small. China was seeking admission into the World Trade Organization, and they were told that they could not get into the World Trade Organization if they got rid of those tariffs because those tariffs were inappropriate for a developed economy. The result of that was the loss of one of the major positive policies in the world to keep greenhouse gas emissions low, because once the style in China became to move towards more Western-style automobiles and the tool of high tariffs was taken away from them or forced on them by the developed nations, it has changed dramatically. And I think a lot of people have pointed to that and sort of wagged their finger at the Chinese. But all that the industrial countries have done since Rio as positives are probably, in the long run, will be wiped out by that policy. So it's clear that the industrialized nations as a whole, not just the United States, but the influential members of the World Trade Organization, have multiple agendas, and that climate change is not very high on that agenda. Often when speaking about the climate change issue, I ask people to think what their grandchildren are going to be thinking or their great-grandchildren are going to be thinking 50 or 100 years about our generation. And we don't know how that's going to turn out, but I do believe that this World Trade negotiations may be looked back as perhaps the straw that broke the camel's back. Because if we did what-if studies before we knew the World Trade Organization was going to do this, on what would happen to the world's oil supplies and to carbon emissions if China had automobiles at the rate of Thailand. Not at the rate of the United States, of Thailand. It blew everything way off the charts. Based on policies in place last fall, EIA projects that that world emissions will continue to rise rapidly. That's the number part on your sheet there. It's not broken down all by countries. It is for some. By 2025, U.S. emissions are estimated to be higher than all OECD, Europe, and Japan combined. All OECD, Europe, and Japan combined. Much more populous than the United States. By the year 2015, China is estimated to surpass the U.S. in emissions, which then raises the position, should the United States join with Europe and Japan and then work on the China question later, or should it wait to do anything until China is part of a comprehensive agreement? It's clear that if neither does anything, we will be seeing very major and unwelcome changes in the world's climate, and so at this point, the mutual death pact label seems accurate. Now, I didn't think this mutual death pact thing up, incidentally. There's a book called Hell and High Water by a fellow named Joe Rome. He is a former Department of Energy official. He's a PhD from MIT. It came out, I believe, in January of this year. Unfortunately, just about the same time that Joe and his wife were having their first child. So it's not been promoted very well. But if you're looking for one good book to read on climate change, Joe Rome's book, I think, would be good. Now, to give some perspective on the China position, I would like to look at the color graph that you have all there. This isn't about China per se, but I think it's a graph that you don't see very often, and it puts this in a little bit different perspective. The yellow graph is this is actually only on oil consumption because I couldn't find this graph for greenhouse gas emissions, but this is a rough approximate for it because oil emissions are going to be roughly proportional to greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, this reflects what's going on in the transportation sector. But it is not a measure of just greenhouse gases. But you can see oil consumption in the U.S. and Canada per person, this is per capita, far exceeds that of other industrialized nations. And that of other industrialized nations greatly exceeds the rest of the world. So if you start it as an operating assumption, as I think every scientist who studied this issue would agree, that the black bar at the end has to come down. The rest of the world, it's hard to imagine, unless you say they're not allowed to grow economically, that cannot rise at least somewhat. Hopefully not very much, but it would have to rise somewhat. Which then means that the other industrialized are going to have to come down, and the yellow line is going to have to come down a whole lot. And that's why for the industrialized nations, I think they're setting goals of 50% cuts. So the question is, can you find a lifestyle that is satisfactory? And I don't think that's as big a problem as it might appear. My brother, at my urging just this last week, bought a Honda Civic Hybrid, and he's getting 40 to 50 miles a gallon for it. It's a wonderful car, very comfortable, extremely safe. So I don't think that this is something that's a deal breaker, but it gives another, what if the Rio Treaty had said, okay, we're going to portion X amount of emission credits per person around the world? And I think we're going to have to admit that there's going to be some bifurcated system out there to make all of this work. I think that the United States is going to have to move ahead of China for a couple of reasons. One is we have at present no intellectual schema about how we're going to work China into this. They can't be worked in on the baseline level. There haven't been the kind of frank discussions, and I'm not sure the Chinese are ready to have those frank discussions. Certainly we don't have a high moral platform to have those discussions. So if just the intellectual inputs to find a system would be immense and delay things for quite a while. Moreover, the U.S. needs to develop advanced technologies, which could include nuclear, which basically already exists, or it could include clean coal, in which case you could separate the carbon dioxide from the waste stream basically by gasifying the coal and then re-injecting it into a pipeline and sending it back to someplace for underground injection. That's a technology that is not in place. I believe there are one or two demonstration projects in the world. There will be some built in the United States, but hopefully that will provide another option. But it's rather than have the Chinese adopt good technologies, I think we ought to do that too. But we have to be on the cutting edge here in developing very advanced technologies if the world is going to have an advanced style of life along with one that's safe for the environment. There's another equity issue involved that the Chinese will raise if you have this discussion with them, and that is that since the emissions stay in the atmosphere for such a long time, the United States, which has been basically generating 25% of the world's carbon with about 5% of the world's population for a very long time, a lot of that concentration that up there is ours. So even when they've caught up with us in emissions, we perhaps bear some responsibility for what's up there now. I do want to close on an optimistic note. I do, and I will comment on the Chinese and Bush statements if you ask me about them. But the optimistic notes are some strong legislation is moving in Congress. There are several bills that have bipartisan support that have teeth in them and would make a definite difference. And those could happen without any international agreement. And the issue is not so much international agreement, it's everybody cutting emissions. And eventually that does require international agreement. But I think there's a lot that could happen, and it is possible that 2007 might be seen as the end of a long period of complacency about this issue. I think it is rather remarkable that in the 90s our emissions were allowed to grow at such a rapid rate. It does increase the pressure to do something quickly, and so the pain may be a little greater than if we had started earlier on this, but that's where we are. Now, I tried to keep this as short as possible because sometimes the audience here knows more about the subject than the speaker, and ask good questions. So I'm welcome, and if you need to, for us to cut off the camera because you want to be provocative, we can work on that. Thank you. Yeah, Rochelle?
Do you know of any estimates where if we went all nuclear and all electric vehicles, how quickly we'd start seeing a shift in the greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I mean, that's a hypothetical because that assumes you throw away every working electric plant you have in the country, and the capital cost of that would be incredible. But that would solve the problem. If you were 100% electricity, you could supply all the needs of currently provided by electricity. Then you'd have to build enough plants to take on all the needs of the transportation sector, which could come either from batteries or from hydrogen. I would think batteries make more sense than hydrogen. So that is theoretically possible. Now, France actually was one of the, if you look at them over a long haul, a lot of their nuclear plants were built in the 1980s. They generally have had a good record over time. I think they've had a little more trouble recently going deeper. But that is one way to do it. You do get problems of uranium supplies, and that gets you in the question of reprocessing and breeder reactors, and reprocessed fuel is more susceptible to terrorist problems. So that's not a free lunch. But I do think a heavy nuclear commitment may make some sense, and I'm actually hoping they build a few nuclear plants in the next few years. The federal government has agreed to subsidize the first 5 plants that are built in this country since the industry has been dormant for quite a while. I think, lest that sound too attractive, it would be much more cost-effective to do a heavy conservation effort first, because it would be cheaper to get the savings from conservation and then see what your needs were, and then you can move to alternative fuels, whether it's solar or nuclear or whatever. Yes?
I travel around the world, and I know the gasoline price is really cheapest in the world is in the United States. So there is a theory, a school of thought, if you raise the gasoline tax, reduce the consumption, what do you think the possibility of that kind of law get passed, and what impact would that have?
Well, that's a very good question about the gasoline tax. It's one that Tom Friedman sometimes asks, shouldn't we have a gasoline tax? I actually have perhaps a little bit of a surprising answer on that. The Europeans have obviously done better with the higher gasoline tax than we have had in this country with the lower gasoline tax. However, if you look at the period from 1975 to 1988, when we had severe limitations on automobile mileage efficiency, we were doing as well as the Europeans. So if we can do efficiency standards, I think those work as well as taxes. There's 2 problems with the tax approach. One is it's a regressive tax. That can be offset if you rebate it in a way that recognizes that. We also don't know what economists call the elasticities are. We don't know how high that tax has to be to change behavior patterns. We do know that the price of gasoline went from 90 cents to $3, and driving kept increasing. So the tax itself, I think this is such a massive problem, we will need taxes, But if I had to say right now what we should do, I think the efficiency standards are more palatable politically, and I think they'll provide a quicker and more certain result. But ultimately, there are parts of it that the tax needs to deal with. Like, do you live 2 miles from where you work, or do you live 20 miles from where you work? Having a fuel-efficient automobile doesn't change that equation. Gasoline price might. So it will have a role to play, but I don't think it will be the major role in the next 5 or 10 years. Yes?
If we could make you a climate change czar here in the United States with a 10-year term, what are your top few priorities?
Okay. Well, the first one would be the passing the mileage efficiency standards to require at least 40 or 50 miles per gallon average by 2040, 2050, something in that range. I would try to eliminate subsidies for corn-based ethanol, which is a very expensive way to get very limited benefits, and put all the subsidies on cellulosic ethanol and biofuels, where you do get very excellent benefits, partly because diesel engines are so efficient, and it's going to be hard to get enough diesel out of refineries, so biofuels are going to be very important. So if you combine, if you get a car that's getting, say, 45 miles per gallon, and half of that's coming from biofuels, or even a 30, you've made substantial progress. Now, what do you do about buildings and electricity? You go in and you do the insulation. I think every house over 4,000 square feet ought to have a heavy solar collector requirement for the roof. I think utilities ought to have a phased-in minimum renewable portfolio of 20%. Many states are doing this. That's about the level that it can be done without having overly dramatic impact on price. And then we need to keep pushing the envelope on the research on clean coal plants and nuclear. There's a scientist at Princeton named Sokoloff who has done what he calls the wedges of dealing with climate change. What are the 5 or 6 big things where you get big measurable results? Fortunately, that's summarized in Joe Rome's book, so you can also get it if you get an old issue of Scientific American or something like that. But the industrial sector is actually doing the best job of all of our sectors so far. For them, the bottom line is more clearly connected to energy, and they operate at scales like we have an expert on the Walmart situation here today. For Walmart, they can save just a little bit one place, but when you multiply it all over the place, those savings add up. So the industrial sector is one where I see less necessity for government intervention, but that's where a tax might make a difference. They respond more quickly to price signals than the commercial sector generally does, and certainly much more rapidly than the residential or transportation or housing sector does. Yes?
Energy was such a big thing during the Carter administration, and I'm curious why the Carter Library and Center don't have a larger focus themselves on energy and climate change like that, because it's going to affect the world's poor as well as industrial nations.
Well, yeah, I mean, the center has chosen health and peace as its areas. I certainly would like to see a lot of attention on climate change. Carter has spoken on it more in the last year or two. At the library, we are not an advocacy institution. I, in my own personal capacity, can do it. But we do have a wall there on the Carter energy policies, and we just recently put in one of the solar collectors that was put in the spring of 1979 and then taken down in 1986. So that's there for display. And I do a lot of, more in a personal capacity than at the library. I do a lot of speaking on campuses. I have an article coming out on Carter's policies on renewable energy that are going to be published by Georgia University Press, and I'm working on this book. And the book, although it's mainly about what I call the quest for energy independence, which was the effort to reduce oil imports, that overlaps a lot with climate change, because in the 80s, U.S. production of greenhouse gas emissions was stabilized. We didn't have a policy to do it. Almost nobody has gone back and looked at those numbers, but amazingly enough, they were stabilized. Now, part of that was even after 3 Mile Island, there were quite a few nuclear plants built, but people cut back their mileage, they insulated their houses, they had these more fuel-efficient cars, and so there was that wonderful spin-off effect. We also have had some speakers at the library on climate change. Mike Tidwell, who wrote the good book on climate change and weather, he was a speaker there some time ago. So it's always a good idea to check the webpage there and see who's coming to speak. We had Paul Hawken, who's a great environmentalist speaker. Several of you were there a week or two ago. Yes?
Tesla Motors, are you familiar with them?
A little bit.
They developed a car that'll do 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. It has a range of 250 miles. They're charging $92,000 for it. All right? But it's got great reviews. And my question is, we just closed 2 plants down here in Atlanta. Ford closed and Chevy closed a plant here. And my question is, why are not, in your opinion, the automobile industry is really addressing this problem, given the fact that 60% of its energy or more is spent on automobiles?
Yeah. Well, I actually don't blame Detroit as much as some people who I agree with on other issues do. I think Detroit tries its best, and maybe not always perfectly, to anticipate what customers want. And I think in their mind, I think one, that I'm a little skeptical of the $92,000 price until they're building them, more of them and selling them, because we were quite certain the Japanese initially were selling the hybrids as loss leaders. That's proprietary information, so you don't know for sure, but we felt that was the case. So I don't know, but if there's a market out there for that automobile, then the companies are really being stupid. But I don't know that there is. There certainly is more than there would have been 3 or 4 years ago. But see, this is the difficulty from if you're a government planner, or I'm the czar, if we're inventing new technologies, it's a little different than inventing the space shuttle or the atomic bomb, because the customer was the government. So the price ultimately didn't make any difference. Today you have to sell the person a car that they want to buy. And I'm not that familiar with a Tesla car, but if I'm someone that likes to do carpentry, I want something I can put some lumber in, and people tend to buy their cars based on the 2 or 3 days a year where they're going to have the maximum load. So, so what I'm more interested in is something like the Honda Civic, which has some of the technology of the Tesla car and can really make huge changes in and of itself. Yes.
It's useful to talk about energy consumption per person, but wouldn't it be fair, just using your numbers on your chart here, to point out that per dollar GDP, where we consume 25% of the energy, we also provide 25% of the world's gross domestic product. If you're looking for solutions, I think you need to have both the personal and the macroeconomic numbers in mind.
Well, the reason I didn't present that is if you look at the numbers presented by the current administration, they're almost all suggested as emissions per unit of GDP. So for instance, the EPA case, the Bush administration took the position that we were reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases. And this was based, if you read the fine print, that we were reducing energy intensity, which is the measure of energy per unit of GDP. And that is commonly used by the administration. And even in an audience this educated, I suspect that when someone gets up and says, we are reducing energy intensity, they think emissions are going down. So our economy is going up by 3% a year. And the position right now of the United States government, at least it may have changed, but it's not clear yet, is that it's okay for us to increase our emissions 1% a year because our economy is growing 3% a year. I think if this was a longer speech, I would have put it in. But I do think that when the United States is almost solely focused on that measure, as it has been, it is creating a mentality that's impossible to deal with the rest of the world. Because basically what it's saying is the richer you are, the more you can pollute. If that is the ultimate position, even if it's right, I don't think it would be accepted by the world. Yes.
Do you have an opinion on the effectiveness or the likelihood of a carbon trading scheme actually being implemented?
I'm somewhat skeptical of carbon trading because it's so complex. It sounds easy. You say, okay, we cap carbon, and then if you make deeper cuts than are required, you can sell your excess credits to somebody else. That is a sound concept. At a theoretical level, no one can argue with it. But how do you balance planting a tree and driving an automobile? And if you're driving an automobile, who is the cap on? Is it on the person that made the gasoline? Is it on the driver? Is it on the manufacturer of the car? And I think a lot of those problems have been swept under the rug. And there's one other very, very major issue in cap and trade that people don't want to discuss. Do you auction the credits off so that you have to buy credits and then presumably you pass the cost on to your customer, or are you grandfathered in? If you are grandfathered into a certain level of emissions, you have created a new OPEC, because basically you'll have less supply of energy, and the people who have credits to that energy will get higher prices, probably more than making up for their loss of volume. And the effects on the economy, I would think, would be difficult. Many schemes, that's the way they work. The ones that produce the best economic result is when you have the tax on, you auction off the credits. And then you take that money and you rebate it to offset the employers and the employees' side of Social Security. That would not offset the whole thing, but it would offset part of it. So what you would do is you would end the taxation on labor, which is something we want to encourage, and you discourage the use of carbon-emitting fuels, which is something we don't want to encourage. So you would make that switch, and when you do it that way, the effects on the macroeconomy are not that great. There are some transition costs, and you're moving some capital from certain investments into other investments, but the impacts on percentage GDP growth are relatively modest. However, this will ultimately be decided by our Congress. So there will be strong arguments on both sides that will have, and so it's hard to know how that will turn out. Yes.
Do you see this Asia-Pacific partnership on clean development and climate that the U.S. and China and 4 other countries are part of as being something that can produce something substantial, or is it more the equivalent of the executive suite establishing a committee to study the issue to make sure the issue gets buried?
I think that it is useful to the extent that it's focusing more appropriately on the technologies that will be needed to deal with climate change. Secretary Bodman, who is President Bush's second Secretary of Energy, I think has done a better job than either Secretary Abraham or, frankly, even than the Clinton administration in focusing on the key technologies. What are the key technologies? There's cellulosic ethanol. They're separating carbon dioxide from coal combustion and nuclear. So, but it ducks the question of how you get those technologies into the market, which I was referring to earlier. And it's amazing, 20 years ago we were talking, well, there's all this technology out there for the automobile, and much of it's not in the market today. So you cannot have a policy approach that's solely focused on technology. Certainly that helps, but it's not anywhere near a total solution.
Jay, I think it's a very good note on which to close because of our time. We thank you very much for giving us a very timely presentation.
And really make huge changes in and of itself.
It's useful to talk about energy consumption, so here are the numbers. Which are you fair just using your numbers to point out that for $1 GDP, where we can spend 25% of the energy deficit by
well, the reason I didn't present that is if you look at the numbers presented by all current administrations, they're almost all suggested as emissions per unit of GDP. For instance, the EPA case that Bush administration we were reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases, and this was based, if you read the fine print, that we were reducing energy intensity.